Welcome to a strand of debates called Making It in the 21st Century. First of all, I'd like to thank our strand sponsors, Jaguar Land Rover, for partnering us. In terms of the session today, Manufacturing the Great Comeback, I firstly want to thank our sponsor, AlixPartners, who are business consultants, business improvement specialists, and specialists in operational performance. Just to kind of introduce Manufacturing the Great Comeback, are we at the zenith of a new era in manufacturing, engineering capability? Lots has been made in the news, for example, about 3D printing, the potential of global supply chains, and, of course, engineering know-how. There are many examples in the news, on TV programs, websites and so on, about some fantastic examples of manufacturing and engineering. Or, are we at a time when actually things have gone too far? The service economy is the prevailing sort of sense of how this country, for example, and many other Western countries are structured. So what chance is there for manufacturing ever to make a comeback? Are things kind of too far gone to kind of relive our bygone age, as it were? And even more, do we have the ambition, the desire to really create a new manufacturing sector? After all, given the talk about the service economy and finance industry, are we really ambitious enough and even open enough for growth, for the large-scale investment, perhaps, that manufacturing will really need or require in order to make something significant happen? So that's just a couple of questions that I want to sort of pose to yourselves and to the panel. So now I want to introduce the panel, and then they will come back with their introductions. So first of all, on my right, I have Mike Wright, who's Executive Director of Jaguar Land Rover, the sponsor of this strand. Mike works closely with Jaguar Land Rover's CEO on corporate strategies to deliver Jaguar Land Rover's growth ambitions, so a very important person to have here today. On my left is Peter Marsh, manufacturing editor for the Financial Times. He's the author of numerous books on microelectronics, robots, space industry, and now a new book called The New Industrial Revolution, Consumers, Globalization, and the End of Mass Production. On my right, immediate right, is Andrew Bergbaum, Director of AlixPartners, a manufacturing industry consultant. Andrew has an engineering degree, spent the early part of his career in the automotive industry in Europe and Japan, with senior roles in procurement, supply chain, and manufacturing. Again, a very interesting, I'm sure, perspective you'll have on this discussion. And last but not least is James Matthews, management consultant, founding member of the New York Salon, and a writer on economics and business. Very happy to get James all the way from America to come here for us today as well. So let's kick things off, and Mike.
Good morning, everybody, and can I add my welcome to the Battle of Ideas session. Manufacturing the Great Comeback, or manufacturing the 21st century, clearly for a company like mine, is a hugely important question, and something that we frankly wrestle with every day of our business life. But maybe I could start by just giving you a little bit of context about my company and how we see it, and then sort of talk about some of the issues that we're having to address. The automotive industry in the UK is enjoying actually quite a remarkable renaissance. I'm sure you've seen the statistic that says that we're actually exporting collectively across the industry more cars now than we did back in 1976. But of course the profile of that business has radically changed through those 30 or 40 years. And we feel as Jaguar Land Rover that we're very much at the heart of that renaissance. But it's not just about producing cars, it's much more complex than that. We're one of the UK's largest exporters now of any sector. Last year we exported about £8 billion worth of revenue around the world. We sell in 177 countries around the world. So we genuinely have a company with a global footprint in terms of our consumers. And we're enjoying success in a number of markets around the world. China is one, but even in Europe, where there is a downturn in the industry, our sales went up by 35%. And I mention those stats not to just make a kind of vox pop about the business, but you can't achieve those results without having a very strong product offering. And one of the great questions about manufacturing is, if you haven't got a good product creation process, that's innovating and designing great products, you're going to find it difficult to manufacture and sell products in what I would argue is one of the most competitive industries across the world. The automotive sector has been around for over 100 years, but in many cases is still at the vanguard of technological innovation, wrestling with all sorts of challenges, whether they come from the consumer or the regulator, or indeed ourselves. We source about 50% of our supply by revenue here in the UK. So not only have we got 22,000 employees based in the UK through 6 locations in the Midlands and the northwest of England, interestingly well outside of London, and maybe that's a question that we can come back to in terms of the perception of manufacturing here in London compared with outside of London. But we've got about 170,000 people in the supplier base who are dependent on our success. So the integrated complexity of the automotive industry, relying on suppliers to be very much part of our value creation process, is another really important question that we have to tackle with on a regular basis. The key point, though, about our business is we are led by design, engineering and innovation. If we haven't got the world's greatest designers and the world's greatest engineers working on our 2 campuses at Gaydon near Warwick and Whitley in Coventry, we're not going to create the products that the consumers are going to value and buy and make our success. So over the last 4 or 5 years, we've invested a huge amount of money. We invest about £2 billion a year on our product creation and innovation process, which is a very significant sum of money. All of it is spent in the UK, or virtually all of it is spent in the UK. And that actually marks us out as different to other UK automotive manufacturers, where the product creation process happens elsewhere in the world, by and large, and they then manufacture here, which is really important because it supports the supplier base. But Jaguar Land Rover, we reckon we spend about 80% of the total automotive R&D and product creation investment here in the UK. And that puts us up a level with other companies like Rolls-Royce and British Aerospace, who have got a great and deserved reputation for engineering excellence. But our competitors, and I'm sure the other speakers will touch on this, in that context then aren't here in the UK. And it's self-evident that we're up against particularly the 3 German premium brands who do all of their research, innovation and design largely in Germany. So when we're looking to answer the questions of how do you build up a great product range and how do you invest and get the skill set and everything else you need to design and innovate, the benchmarking that we have to do, frankly, we have to look over the water and find out what's going on in the rest of the world. So this question about, a UK revival is hugely important, but if you don't look outside the UK and see what goes on across the world, you're not going to get the right answers, and we could very quickly become quite isolated. We also are sponsoring and leading more collaborative work across academia, industry and government indeed, in terms of really trying to get our research and innovation capability to be at least world-class and ideally the best in the world. So one example is our relationship with Warwick University. We have relationships with universities all over the country, but in Warwick we've based 200 of our advanced research engineers actually on the campus to get them right at the cutting edge of new innovation and new ideas on innovation. And that's a great example of industry, academia, helped with government to actually generate new ideas. Now, for us, that's a pretty new model in this country. To go back to the global point, the Koreans, the Germans, the Americans have been doing that for years. So we've got a lot of catching up to do. And at that point, I'll end.
Fantastic. Peter.
What I want to do is just to explain briefly 3 things from my perspective. A bit of history about Britain and manufacturing, where Britain is now, and number 3, I suppose, what the potential is. Just to say why I've got some claim to knowing about this, I suppose for the last 15 years I've been doing lots of visiting manufacturers. I suppose that's part, in my professional world, that's what I've been doing. I've probably, over that period, been to see about 2,000 manufacturing companies in about 30 countries, all because I work at the Financial Times. And on occasion I've had to write a few stories about it, obviously, during that period. But I suppose that's given me a fortunate position to be able to see an awful lot about what's going on and then try to draw in the kind of micro, as where I've seen it, with the macro trends. The result of all this is this book, which Martyn mentioned, which took an awful long time to write, but it's now out there and people can buy it if they'd like. I mean, a bit about how we came to this position in Britain. If you went back to 1900, or actually to be precise, 1895, you'd find that Britain was the biggest manufacturing country in the world, responsible for 15% of world output. If you went back to 1830, you'd find that actually Britain was quite low down the league table. There was only 30 countries of any importance back then, and Britain was about number 5 or 6. China was the biggest, actually, simply because it had more people than anybody else. There weren't any hidden productivity savings due to innovation, because the Industrial Revolution had really kicked in. The next 40 years, Britain had the ascendancy because of the Industrial Revolution. The technology advances that you had there catapulted Britain up the league table to number 1. For the last 100 years, America's been the number 1, till last year when China took over again. So it's almost kind of back to the future, really. China was number 1 in 1830, it's number 1 today. But it's number 1 only by a little bit. America's number 2. America's got 10 million people working in manufacturing. China's got 100 million. China produces just a little bit more than America. But Britain actually isn't in as bad a position as a lot of people think. It's number 9 in the world league table. Most people, if you ask them, I bet you can try this out on your friends, they'll say, oh, Britain's number 30. Britain's number 9. It's obviously a lot less than it was. It was 15% of world output in manufacturing. Now it's 2.3%. So it's gone down. But it's not in such a bad position as many people think. And this is one of the discussions that I think is important about where Britain goes. A lot of people don't realise the strengths that Britain's got. So where are we today? It's quite hard to shine a light on British manufacturing because a lot of the interesting things that are going on are hidden away in small companies. In the past, if you wanted to find out about manufacturing 50 years ago, you'd go to the centre of Birmingham, you'd go to the centre of Sheffield, go and visit some huge companies. With the exception of a few big ones like Jaguar Land Rover, we've heard about Nissan, there's still a few steel companies around employing altogether 20,000 people in Britain. But most of the really interesting things going on in manufacturing are far less easy to find. They're in the industrial estates, hidden away, 100 people working in Solihull or somewhere like that, which most people wouldn't normally go to. Well, Jaguar Land Rover, of course, would. But you have, which is why it takes a long time to track these people down. They're not visible, they don't advertise. Unless you're in the supply chain, you buy from them or you supply to them, you wouldn't know. You as a consumer wouldn't know either because their item is buried away deep inside somebody else's product. There's many examples of this. I mean, one really wonderful example is 2 companies down in Poole in Dorset, who are the biggest companies in the world making air-bearing spindles. Hardly anyone knows what air-bearing spindles are. They're things that were around at 300,000 revolutions per minute, or 20 times faster than a jet engine, and they power drills. The drills make little tiny holes in circuit boards. If you didn't have these holes in circuit boards, you wouldn't have such dense arrays of chips that go in iPhones and the like. So if you didn't have the air-bearing spindles, you wouldn't have the today's modern phones that work as well as they do. is down to these two companies based in Poole. I won't even bother to tell you the names because you're bound to forget as soon as I've told you. But I just take my word for it. They're there. You can read about them in my book, actually. The potential, which is, I suppose, what this debate is about. A lot of people have got interested in manufacturing, more than anything because of the financial crisis of a few years ago. It made people think, well, should we in Britain have had so much faith in the service part of our economy, particularly financial services, wouldn't it be an idea to revisit some of the past for the UK? But the point I'm trying to make is that certainly it's a good idea to boost manufacturing, but you won't go about doing it by looking to see what was going on 100 years ago in Britain's heyday. You need to do something about it given today's circumstances. I mean, my take on this, and you have a similar level of debate in other countries, America being a good example. My take on all this is that if you study what Britain's got, these smaller firms, you look at what they've done, what they need, and then you build on that. And I think that's something that we can perhaps discuss later on. So that's my brief exposition to get things going from my perspective.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
So, as I was thinking about this debate, the question that popped into my mind was, if we had a renaissance in the UK, how would we judge that it was successful? Or rather, what metrics would we use to say that it actually happened? And I'll leave that thought with you for a moment. So let's say see where we are today. I'm sure most of you know that manufacturing today has pretty much flatlined. So in terms of economic output, it pretty much is what it was 15 years ago in nominal terms, which means in real terms it's reduced. It currently accounts for about 11% of our national output, and if you compare that to the late 70s where it was 30%, you can see a massive drop. And if we then look at employment, whereas today there's 2.5 million people employed in manufacturing, it was 7 million 30 years ago. So that's a drop of 2/3 in one generation. So everybody knows that it's not just because we've become less competitive on the world stage, but also that productivity improvement means that the equivalent employee now produces double what they did 30 years ago. Therefore, we need 50% of the people to manufacture the same amount of goods. The task of getting back to a level of employment where we were with this productivity is absolutely enormous, in my opinion. So the question that I keep asking myself is, would a renaissance be judged a success if we return to the same level of economic output, but jobs stayed the same, i.e. 2.5 million? A lot of our industry has gone. So 15 years ago, we had things like clothing, leather goods, textiles, small and home electronic goods, just to name but a few. These are all gone. All of these segments have commonality. They require high levels of labour and are fairly easy to transport. And of course, they therefore go to the place, wherever it is in the world, that has those things. Some expected that once the developing world inflated its wages, that this would all come back. But I think the reality is that many of these goods are now produced in global centres of excellence, where there is massive global economies of scale. Footwear is one example, where supply chains are really intricately linked, and therefore the barriers to re-entry, if you will, are very high. It's not all bad news. I'm painting quite a bleak picture, but it's not. We have seen significant growth in manufacturing over the past few years. Let's take one by one. Food production. So our food processing industry has grown much faster than our population has grown, in a large part down to our increased requirements for local provenance. And basically, I can see very little prospect of that reducing. The pharmaceutical industry also is now a third bigger than it was half a generation ago. And with an ageing population, I can't see that reducing either. We are world leaders in elements of high tech. The UK has the largest independent semiconductor design industry, and about half of the market for application-specific integrated circuits, and 40% of Europe's are designed here. In renewables, we've taken a very strong position as the market has turned from nascent to mainstream and produced many components for wind turbines and the like. And of course, aerospace and defence has seen massive growth in the past 15 years, and we are now second only to the United States. 11 of the top 100 global A&D companies are here based in the UK. However, on this one, we'd probably be right to question the longer-term viability of an industry which is predominantly funded by a government with such financial issues. So the likelihood of growth in the UK, well, I think that will these growing industries be able to pull us back to the level that we were? Well, maybe in terms of output. I can certainly see growth in terms of output, but certainly not in terms of employment. One of those reasons is Europe, where the US has Mexico, for which a lot of the nearshoring is done. That's stuff coming back from China. We have Eastern and Far Eastern Europe, where there is relatively high education levels, low labour costs, critical access to raw materials and energy, and of course free access to the EU with its 500 million people. It makes it quite an attractive place to invest. Transportation within Europe, of course, is much better than it used to be for two main reasons. The first one is investment in infrastructure, and the second one is the consolidation of the logistics industry, where we've seen far fewer companies with now much higher vehicle utilisation, and therefore even the effects of the high oil price have been offset by these improvements. So, what's going to happen in the future? Well, I think that, as I've just said, high-tech, niche and specialised luxury good manufacturing will continue to grow here. And with the right support, could certainly contribute more to the UK economy than it currently does. But the chances of high labour manufacturing returning to the UK, I think, are very slim. In areas that will grow, productivity will mean that economic output will grow faster than full-time employment. So if I go back to the original question that I asked, by which measure would we judge an economic renaissance or manufacturing renaissance to be a success, mine would be employment. And by that measure, I do not believe that we will ever get back to where we used to be. So what we need to do is invest heavily in areas where we're already strong and redouble our educational establishments' efforts to produce far more engineers, technologists, scientists and innovators. Only by doing this will manufacturing become a more significant contributor to the UK economic output.
Jamie.
I'm going to cover 3 points briefly. First, look at the context of manufacturing in the broader economy, why it's important. Secondly, to look at this question of renaissance. I mean, it's been discussed about in the UK. I'm going to talk about in the US context. And then third is what needs to be done, and specifically what stands in the way of, what are the barriers to making change. So first of all, to put this in context, I mean, just to kind of lay my cards out on the table, I do think that productive industry and manufacturing in particular needs to be promoted. That may be a no-brainer here, given the discussion, but there is, in the US, there's still quite a lot of debate. There's a kind of a free market constituency that would say the state should have nothing really to do, at least at the national level. And I do think that what this means is a shifting of the economy's balance away from finance and more toward productive industry. Not because there's something inherently evil with finance, and I don't think finance should be clamped down on, but I think if we do boost industry, it'll restore finance to its proper place in the economy. In the US, the main talk is around deficits and debt, and what that does is it puts a limit on the imagination of what can be done. But the key thing is that in order to really address the issue of government deficits and debt, you need strong economic growth. And then the key to strong economic growth is really robust, non-financial industry. And by productive industry, I would say, let's not focus just on manufacturing, because it's not just making stuff. There's, other industrial industries like energy, and there's also non-financial services that are productive of new wealth. But manufacturing is especially important, I would say, because it's an area where clearly you can raise productivity, and that's key to raising living standards. And secondly, there are a lot of linkages with services. If you lose manufacturing, there's a risk you're going to lose the service part that's aligned with it. Moving on to my second point, what's the state of manufacturing? And I'm going to focus on the U.S. The same word, renaissance, is used in the U.S. context. Manufacturing in the last couple of years has grown faster than other industries in the U.S. We see examples of, big news about Google deciding to stay in the U.S. We've seen reshoring. We've seen GE, Caterpillar moving back from Asia to the U.S. And reports like the Boston Consulting Group had a very prominent series of reports, very bullish about U.S. manufacturing prospects. Is there really a renaissance going on? Well, I think it's very questionable. Some of it is really clearly just the bouncing back from the recession, and it's questionable whether it can be sustained. One of the leading academics in this area is a guy named Robert Atkinson, and he recently wrote that if you look by sector within manufacturing, 13 of 19 manufacturing sectors saw declines in output over the past decade, while the economy was generally growing. And what's clear is that in the U.S., it's really computer and related industries that are standouts, and in particular, what you have to look at is things like not just output, but with the investment that's going in, and really it's suboptimal. There still are a lot of companies sitting on a lot of cash. And I think when you look at Renaissance, what you'd really be looking at is not just traditional measures of output coming back, things like that, but really, are you seeing real innovation on a widespread basis across the economy? And there I'd say you're really not seeing what's needed and what to keep moving forward. Two things here. One is you don't see scale. You don't see big, ambitious, step change kind of advances. Scale is important. I mean, a lot of the changes that are going on are very localized, more artisan. But scale is important because it's very key to productivity, to gaining, economies of scale. Let's take an example. Miniaturization electronics, very important. But how are we going to produce those electronic goods in a way that are affordable for people on a mass scale, especially, with masses of people across the world? On energy, it's clear we need massive operations. It's just not going to cut it having, windmills on people's houses. And if you look at, like the Obama stimulus package in 2009, there's a lot of the so-called green technology. It was really around like things like home insulation, not really like truly innovative. And what we're really talking about, I think, with innovation is really new industries, right? New sources of jobs. In the past, we've had things like, TV, nuclear power. Now, today we are seeing some areas, you need to be balanced about this. There's clearly areas in the U.S., nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, robots that are developing. But it's really, as I say, it's not widespread enough. So to my third and final point about what needs to be done, I mean, you can list things that could support manufacturing. Immediately I think of not necessarily picking winners, but, supporting basic R&D, training and education. A lot of skilled jobs are going have openings. I could come up with a list. I'm sure in the U.S. or U.K. context, folks here could think of things. I think the main thing I want to emphasize is what's holding it back. And I think there's three things, and they're really broad and social, not to do with manufacturing per se or technical. One is an argument for growth, two, in favor of risk-taking, and third, we need to really promote big and ambitious thinking. And I can't develop those points because I ran out of time, but maybe in the discussion.
I want to ask a couple of questions of the panel from what they've said. So on one hand, we have sort of Jamie, who is arguing for more sort of big-scale ideas, ambition, but then perhaps others are arguing more in terms of a kind of a more pragmatic approach to re-enlivening manufacturing, about the fit that we can play within the kind of global supply chain and to try and cultivate industries in perhaps a more of a pragmatic manner. So I wonder, in the panel, should we be very pragmatic in our approach to kickstarting manufacturing, or as James says, should we be a bit bigger scale in our focus? Who wants to start?
I don't think they are mutually exclusive at all. Manufacturing is an interesting word in its own right. It covers a multitude of activities, even sins. For us, and I can only talk about the automotive world, it starts with a concept and a design, and that's not just a sketch of a car. It could be a really important component. That's where the process starts. There's a whole validation process that you go through. There's a whole engineering, and increasingly these activities are not sequential. You do them in parallel because you want to get to the market quickly. And by the time you come to manufacture the piece, whether it's a car or a component, there's an awful lot of intellectual and innovative work that's been done. And to pick up on James's point, that is where the new thinking comes in as a matter of course. For example, apologies for just quoting Jaguar Land Rover, but we have what we call a virtual reality suite at Gaydon, where a lot of our advanced concept engineering is done in 3D. Where did we get that technology from? Actually from the computer gaming world. And the people who are running it actually came from the gaming world, which there happens to be a little micro centre of excellence in Leamington, which helps. But so I think the great thing to think about when we're answering this question is not to see manufacturing from the past, but to understand that it's an extremely complex process. Quite often now the word advanced is used, and it is advanced. If you haven't been, and I don't care if it's a car factory or a food processing factory or any manufacturing facility, I implore you to go and visit one and just see the level of technology and innovation that's in the manufacturing process here in the UK or anywhere in the world. It's a very, very modern activity. So I don't think there is this sort of pragmatism versus new innovation gap at all, Mark. I think they're one and the same thing.
Peter, how do you respond to that?
Well, I do agree with Mike in the sense that you can have both big, all-encompassing ideas, and there's a good place for that, as well as trying to sow the seeds at a much lower level for activity to be fertilised, if that's the correct word, but grow, and from this you can establish new ideas, new businesses. I mean, to flesh out what I mean, I think there is a role for big government thinking here. Now, some of you might remember, say, in 1978 there was creation of a company in Britain using ideas that today would be considered completely out of date. You had the start of something called InMOS, which was meant to be, under a Labour administration, Britain's answer to Intel, the semiconductor company. There was a big effort to establish InMOS as a state-owned semiconductor company. I mean, you could say kind of predictably that the idea never really worked in commercial terms, but in technological terms it did work, actually. It seeded some very interesting ideas in the Ian Barron and the Transmuter. The interesting thing is, it's like the Big Bang in the universe, that something happens, then you have to wait a few years to get the impacts. And today you can go down to Bristol, where InMOS was based, and you can see about 10 or 20 companies, quite a lot of them not owned by British entities anymore, but doing things, doing productive work, employing people on good salaries. That all was created from InMOS. The same way as you can look at the aircraft carriers project today, £5.2 billion worth of government money, seeded work on 2 aircraft carriers. Now, do you need 2 aircraft carriers? You can have another debate about that from a defence point of view, but it's actually stimulated work in 800 companies around Britain. Now, nuclear power stations, obviously you could say there's more of an obvious requirement for energy. You can have big government thoughts in that kind of area, and it will have an impact on useful, productive manufacturing and technology that goes on much lower down in the economy. Now what do I mean from the ground upwards? Look at Cambridge. Cambridge is probably the best example in Britain of intellectual stroke business, stroke technological activity with several thousand companies there, all completely unplanned due to a number of things going on 30, 40 years ago, but all to do with seeding intellectual capability. What has emerged from Cambridge is a fantastic hotbed of innovation, which Britain needs to develop and see flourishing. Some of it is manufacturing, not all of it. But there's no substitute for seeding intellectual capability, getting clever people together, doing things. Give them a few bankers and legal people to help them produce companies, and you'll get somewhere.
Okay. I mean, Andrew, you were sort of talking about how to measure success and looking at other aspects in terms of the state of manufacturing has sort of flatlined at 11% of the economy, but equally compared to, as you said, where we were in the past, we're very much more productive in terms of how we do make things. So, in a way, strange question to ask perhaps, but what's the problem with that? Because we are employing better technology, better ways of making things using our intellectual capacity and the rest of it, and still producing a fair amount of value from that. Maybe that's just the way it is. So the service sector makes use of that. So what's the problem, if anything?
No, I think it's a valid point. And it's a debate that's far wider than manufacturing.
Yeah.
So if we take my 7 million versus 2.5 million people point of view, and I say, well, that's great. What's happening with all of those other people? What do they do now? Do they all become high-paid bankers or lawyers or consultants? No, probably not, actually. Probably many of them are now £6.18 an hour, minimum wage, working, not really getting any skills. And so what I think happens is, whilst I fully support the knowledge economy, the danger is that you polarise the economy. And what happens is you have these very highly paid technicians, engineers, innovators down in Poole or wherever, and then you have an army of people on very low wages who are then funded by the people that are doing the innovation. So what happens is you have, I think without getting too political, you get a welfare state, you get higher taxes in order to keep these people up to a standard of living. And I think basically the whole level of the economy comes down. So that's a real worry for me, as I think 1 or 2 generations from now. So what I would like to see is methods by which we can take these people out of that level, get them more involved into, if not the highest level of manufacturing thinking or technology thinking, but at least in the supporting area. Otherwise, you're just going to have a polarised service economy.
Okay. I mean, on that though, surely, okay, slightly hackneyed example, but lathe operators and people who made the tooling were never always that well paid. So isn't it going to be the same case, whatever we do?
Well, I mean, this is the question. No, you're right, they weren't that well paid, but they were getting skills, they managed to have some career progression, they become master craftsmen or whatever it is as they were going on, and they obviously could create value.
Okay.
The issue would be what do we do with the Starbucks barista?
Final thing for you, Jamie. I mean, I like the fact that you are wanting to encourage more risk-taking, ambition, big thinking. Obviously great on paper for us to talk the talk, but how do we kickstart that? Because everywhere around us, government are very reluctant, businesses, as you say, are sitting on piles of cash. So what is it going to take to make people start thinking a bit more broadly about the challenge?
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, just before I get to that point, just to say I agree with my fellow panelists about it's not an either or, definitely. And when you see, I live in upstate New York near Corning, and Corning, what Corning has done with its Gorilla Glass, right? Take a prior thing, that's a great use, and that company devotes a tremendous amount of its money into R&D. But the danger in all this discussion around, you're finding your niche and being pragmatic is that from the social, the wide view is that no one's thinking about the seeding and tomorrow in new areas necessarily. What's holding it back isn't limited to this area of within manufacturing itself. I mean, there's a risk aversion generally in society. There's a sort of clinging to safety, the sort of precautionary principle, the idea we can't do anything unless you can prove that it will do no harm. That kind of idea is something pervasive. So the fact that business people are risk averse when society is generally risk averse is not really a surprise. Likewise, there's a lot of immediate objections to growth, the idea of just growth. I mean, it's immediately when you talk about growth, you hear things, it's going to destroy communities, it's going to lead to bad things for the environment, it's going to lead to more stuff that people are going to get obsessed in buying. It's all negative. And even the whole discussion around, as I mentioned earlier, around deficits is really not about growth. And I would say that neither party in the U.S. really has a growth strategy. And so, again, there's a kind of broader cultural sense. And so, in a way, the answer to this is not necessarily to, squirrel away within manufacturing, but at events like this and elsewhere is to try to change the more general climate.
Okay, thanks. So now it's your turn.
What I keep reading everywhere is that additive manufacturing, 3D printing, that is exploding, and that's where the future lies. That sort of turns manufacturing into a service industry, design service, that is. And my question to the panel is, should that give Western countries a reason to be optimistic?
My name's Kevin McCullough. I've got two real quick questions based on differences I noticed in the panel. First one, Peter didn't necessarily mention in his speech, but in the book you seem quite boyish about investment in R&D, whereas Jamie seemed to suggest that it was quite puny levels of investment, lots of companies sitting on cash piles. So I'd like to hear more about sort of perspective on that. And then in terms of centres of excellence, very heartening to hear Mike say that 50% of your sourcing is done in the UK. I'd always kind of more veered on Andrew's point that that the UK was lacking those clusters of centre of excellence, and that's a real barrier to growth. And it's not just a case of having a genius idea and a smart company. You need that wider infrastructure to support it. So I'd just like to hear a little bit more about that.
Okay, thanks.
With the coalition government facing criticism for the levels of support for manufacturing for growth, my question is mainly for Peter. How do you think government can assist the private sector to look for the next manufacturing opportunity?
One of the things I was thinking about, and particularly in this context of how would we measure a renaissance, the way the general public, and I think based on my reading of the US media, this is even more true over there, where they actually think the iPhone is made in China when only 4% of the value added is added in China, is if they can see products on the shelves stamped made in England. One of the impression I've got from all four parts of the members of the panel is if there is a manufacturing renaissance in the English-speaking world, it will not involve final assembly of consumer goods. It will involve, if you like, to combine Jaguar Land Rover, Rolls-Royce and those guys in Poole making air-bearing spindles, things that rotate very, very fast indeed. And so, do you think there is any chance of a consumer good manufacturing coming back, and does it matter?
So, who wants to come back on some of these points?
As we think about what the UK does best, to just go to some other points, manufacturing is not just hitting things very hard or assembling things. It's everything from coming up with the idea through to physically delivering it to people wherever they may be in the world. And therefore, we can say that we won't manufacture, as in we won't have the factories, but we can have design halls and innovation centres where thousands of people can work, and we can take the advantage of our education system in order to push that through. It just so happens that they end up being manufactured in some other country. So the question, I suppose, for us is how do we grow that bit? How do we recognise that really we may not have an advantage in putting things together or bashing things or even taking things apart, but we will have an advantage if we focus of actually doing the bit at the beginning, which is coming up with the concepts. So I think that's something that We, talked about coalitional government. That's the thing that we should be thinking about how to do. But it means taking hard choices. It means actually accepting that, sorry guys, we're not brilliant at putting things together unless we can charge very high margins for them.
Okay. Mike?
Well, I take a little bit of issue with what Andrew's saying, because one of the premises for our company is that if you have the design and engineering excellence, and thank you very much for the comment, here in the UK, actually it's much easier to keep the manufacturing in the UK. The manufacturing, in many respects, is quite generic. And if you don't have that innovation, engineering, centres of excellence, developing new ideas, you're more likely to want to manufacture where it's appropriate. So I think the two actually do go very much hand in hand, but you've got to lead with the innovation first. We're very committed to the three manufacturing plants that we have here in the UK, and of course we've decided that our new engine plant will be here in the UK as well. So I think the two don't go hand in hand. The point about suppliers and supplier excellence, I actually think one of the big, and we're working with the Automotive Council and the UK government on this. One of the biggest challenges for the supplier sector and the supply chain here in the UK is getting them to understand that growth is an opportunity. If you've been through 30 years of stagnation, as Andrew has been saying, getting suppliers to invest in the future and future growth is actually quite difficult. I mean, they're a bit jaundiced about the past. They've got their own investment challenges. And to the point about the coalition somebody asked over here, I think my personal view is that they do get it, that not instead of the financial services sector or instead of the services sector, but the manufacturing, in the broader sense of the word, sector can add something to the economy. But they recognise that skills, supplier financing, all these other enablers that, it was interesting to hear James talk about them being issues in the US. These are really hard challenges that are going to take years to sort out. You can't just flick a switch. It's something that I think will increasingly become a debate. And for us in industry who are planning, my longest planning horizon is actually 2025 right now, real time, because of regulations on CO2. My shortest planning horizon is probably, in product terms, a couple of years. I don't want a political debate about manufacturing. I want a cross-party consensus that actually this is fundamental to the UK economy, and therefore, whatever the election is and whatever, we get a genuine consistency of purpose in terms of developing the supply chains or whatever.
Okay.
To answer one point about what the government should be doing, the big requirement is finance, and Vince Cable has gradually been doing something about this idea of a national bank for business. He should really have done something which I was suggesting he should have done 1.5 years ago, really, which is to just set up a bank in Britain which would be controlled by the government, but bringing in finance from other parties, like the KfW in Germany, or some of the banking endeavours they have in America. Both of them really kind of conventional capitalist economies, but can have state support for companies meshed into the way they do things. So not particularly radical. And staff it with decent people who know about what's going on in business, can bring in government, can bring in funding from other sources, and really be there to support some of the good ideas that are in many manufacturing companies where they don't have enough money to actually get their ideas into fruition. So that's really what they should be doing in a rather more wholehearted way than they actually have done. Somebody else mentioned the idea about is there enough money? You did, didn't you? About I think the distinction that Jamie was getting on is there's probably not. There's a certain reluctance to spend money in investment, new plant and buildings, but I think there is a lot of development money going into good ideas all around the world, because I think a lot of companies do realise that even in difficult times, the difference between good companies and bad companies over the next 20 years is going to be those with the best ideas. And so I don't see any lack of interest in the development side of things and the R&D. Another point that somebody made was about to what degree you can see assembly-type jobs, i.e. old-style manufacturing jobs, as opposed to the kind of whizzy design ideas. And again, I don't agree with Andrew that you can say goodbye to all that. I could take you to companies very close to here, actually, where they're employing a few hundred people in these assembly jobs, making things on the shop floor, who would be the kind of people who've, if you like, always done that. They've left school at 17, they've got some enthusiasm, some level of technical capability. But if you find the right kind of product, they can do it. You can go down to the Mulberry factory in Somerset, where they've employed 300 people, stitching together bags. They happen to be high quality, very good bags. They're going to employ another 300 people on another factory, which they're going to be building in the next few months. Proof that the idea you can't do that in Britain is completely wrong.
So, Jamie, I mean, how do you respond to some of that? Especially also about financing, because is it, you know, if we set up a sort of a bank to do it, is that going to be enough? Even though politics and politicians themselves are equally very timid, you know, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I wouldn't at all disagree with the idea of financing. I mean, clearly there's when there's a reluctance to invest, anything that can get things moving would be welcome. It's just a question of, you know, is that sufficient? I think there's other things as well that need to be done. And I agree with what Mike had said about it's really kind of a sterile debate in the U.S., I'd say the national level. But, you know, like to give an example, if you take San Diego right at the southern part of the U.S., right, you've got developments there in biotechnology and genomes, and it's very much linked with the National Institute of Health, right? So it's sort of government-related body, right? So government is involved. Like, it's not like, should we get government involved? In the U.S., government, the military is already involved in a big way. And then, secondly, you've got Republicans who are in government who are very supportive of that. So the more, and in the U.S., the more local you get in terms of government, the more the ideology goes away. So, and so, it's clearly not an either or. And I've been taking some pops at the Republicans. I mean, if you look at the Obama and the Democrats, it's not as if they've been consistent as well, either. You've got, in some ways, some of the old industrial type policy. I mean, there's a lot of talk about backing, sort of crony capitalism, backing Solyndra, and trying to pick winners. That's really not the way forward. And also, very inconsistent. I mean, there's like, Obama will come out State of the Union and say, oh, we ought to do all these great things, and then you don't hear anything more. I mean, you can't just, this needs consistent work. And you also, and also in terms of energy, it's really clear that, energy is very important to support manufacturing industry generally, and there are a lot of green constraints on developing energy in the U.S. that the Democrats are proposing.
Okay, thank you, panel. So who else wants to speak?
Right, I love my Jaguar, but I couldn't get in the garage. I couldn't get a Jaguar in my garage now. There's a business opportunity. I'd quite be happy to help design a smaller Jaguar. The difference in China is the government is run by engineers. Over here we have a bunch of office boys who kowtow to the EU. And everywhere I look in business, I see the dead hand of the organisation. How do you manage to export to 177 countries with that institution on your back?
Okay, thanks.
I'd like to pick up on the last point that James made in his presentation, and that's the societal attitudes generally towards this problem. I guess that most of in this room are most of you in this room are preaching to the converted. And what I'd like to do is to involve the other 1,000 or so people that are here at this battle of ideas in getting it, and in getting into this issue. And I'd just like to raise two small points of detail within that. The first is the word, they're hijacking this word creative by a bunch of people who paint things blue and produce pictures or music that none of the rest of us are going to understand. Actually, engineering is the most creative activity in the world. Now, I'm an engineer, so I would say that, wouldn't I? But we've got to get that point across, and we've got to get it persistently across. I live in the northeast of England. There is an objection on the part of lots of young people to engineering careers because my granddad was an engineer and he was made redundant. And we've got to now, you know, that's 30 years ago, we've got to overcome that. The second point is the short-termism in industry. And unfortunately, the engineering profession lost a lot of talented young chaps and women to the banking industry 20 years ago. And of course they're engaged in writing fantastic computer programs that trade stocks in the short term, and this all adds to the short-termism. It's an absolute joy to hear someone say, my time horizons vary from 2 years to 20 years. Pity the rest of society doesn't think like that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, my question is about the next generation. So if we're assuming that we want the next generation of British manufacturing to be competitive, how do we help that happen? Is it through changes in primary and secondary education, in our curriculums, through higher education? Are our engineering degrees today relevant? Or is it through some kind of cultural shift? So do we need to go back to a generation of tinkerers? So say programmers using the Raspberry Pi or engineers learning with basic 3D printers?
Very good, because it kind of connects with the question earlier about perceptions as well. So that's something I want to kind of, well, for people to come back on, because I think it's a very important point. And you also mentioned the magic phrase 3D printing, which would be very good for people's views on.
I guess back in the day we had kind of visions of the future, maybe in the Victorian period, maybe even Harold Wilson's white heat of the scientific, not technological revolution. And I wonder to what extent our political leaders are creating a climate in which we have a vision of the future. It might be the space race, it might be something else which can, and perhaps more than aircraft carriers even, that can cohere innovators and manufacturers and designers' activity around the future. It seems to me that, you know, as I think James has argued, we need to create new markets and new industries. If you look at the hoary old example of Apple and the iPhone we're going to talk about a lot, the iPhone is not a product, right? It's a service. It's an ecosystem, to use an inappropriate metaphor. Which has very little to do with the physical thing. The money made in that is by mobile phone companies, by other vendors and so on. How do we imagine the kind of industries that would evolve in that way that would help us to cohere British manufacturing or service manufacturing, whatever you want to call it?
Okay, thank you.
Two things often cited as barriers. I mean, first thing is partly just an echo of the previous question is when you get hold of people, you find, I mean, lots of manufacturers standardly say it's very difficult to get people with the right kind of skills and attitudes. A, do you think that's right? B, what would you change? Okay. Second thing often cited, particularly in ICT, is the way the patent system is now working and the way people are using patent systems. So, for example, think about the way IBM got going. It got going because of huge US state government investment and insistence by the US government that the technology developed was shared amongst private companies, and only then was IBM and a huge ICT ecosystem able to develop profit-wise. Worries about the patent system are now that actually it's destructive rather than constructive. A, do you agree? B, would you change about it?
I think we need to hear in this debate a little bit more about the question of labour and employment, because I think only Andrew's really discussed it. But I think there's a sort of blithe assumption amongst policymakers and intellectuals and people discussing this that a muted manufacturing renaissance would equal a massive increase in employment. And I don't think that's going to be the case. It's not even been the case in China, where massive increase in output hasn't resulted in big increases in recent times in employment. So I'd like to hear more about that from the rest of the panel. Thanks.
I mean, on employment, you're not going to get back, as Andrew said, you're not going to get back to 7 billion. But you are going to develop a kind of ecosystem around that of people working in services. And that's an important point to remember. I mean, on the point about getting new people into it, you've just got to inspire them, and you've got to make them aware of what is going on in the companies today who actually are offering exciting jobs. I think Rolls-Royce, Jaguar Land Rover, people do know about. There's lots of other companies who they don't know about. There's a company called Renishaw down in Gloucestershire, employed 2,000 to 3,000 people, making little kind of widgets for measuring things. And no one knows about them, and if they did, then they would feel inspired by it. On 3D printing, which people have discussed, I mean, I could say something about that, but I mean, why doesn't Abe Reichenthal say something about 3D printing? He runs the 3D Systems, a company in America, and I'd be interested to get Abe's point of view about what 3D printing could mean for Britain.
Let me get the rest of the panel to come back, and then I will get you to introduce yourself. So, Mike, did you want to come back on some of these points?
I think the how do you encourage the next generation question is hugely important, and it links into a lot of the other comments, actually, because one gentleman referred to the legacy, and it's the same in the West Midlands. There are a lot of generational issues where parents and grandparents are actively saying, the last thing you want to do is go into engineering or the automotive sector. We spend a lot of, we have education and business partnership centres on all of our sites, and we try and ourselves, and Mark's referred to other companies, Rolls-Royce, spend a lot of time talking to school kids. There's a thing called Big Bang that you may have heard of, which is actually wonderfully rewarding. They had it at the NAC a few months ago, and there were 55,000 kids going around looking at stands that we put together, and Rolls-Royce and others. But it's much more fundamental than that, clearly. And all the debate that's happening in this country about a new education system, about the STEM agenda, science, technology, engineering, maths, about other softer skills. So even in the service sector, if you were to talk to the service sector about the employability of people interfacing with other people, it's a huge challenge for not only the education system, because it's easy to blame that, but collectively across the piece, industry, service sector, education system, we've got to find a different way of tackling this issue. And again, it's not going to be a quick switch that you can flick. It's something that we've got to focus on over a number of years. The other point about regulation and global regulation, one of the downsides of being a long-standing, successful sector like automotive, and I don't just mean Jaguar Land Rover, is politicians love to play around with it. So the regulators, if you've been around as an industry for 4 or 5 years, they suddenly start taking an interest, whether they want to raise tax out of you or whether they want to control you or steer you. So actually the EU is an issue for us selling in Europe. But we're alongside all of our other competitors, so we're not singled out for special treatment. But it's a consideration when you're in a mature industry.
I suppose I just want to correct the note that we can't do manufacturing. Both of the comments made about manufacturing, Mulberry from Peter, and of course JLR. These are high margin products, and high margin products you can have labour in the UK. It works very well. We just need more high-margin products in the UK. To the point about engineering and how do we encourage the next generation, well, engineering is hard. You need to have maths, you need to have physics, you need to be educated in the sciences. The question is, how do we encourage people to go through a scientific-based education system all the way through GCSEs and A-levels and then go to university? I'm not going to put down creativity, arts and academic subjects, but if we see how many people going to university are now doing engineering, just engineering, it's fallen off a cliff. And if you compare that to the Indians, who have 100 times the number of engineers graduating every year than we do in the UK, 100 times, that just leads you to show, well, are we still going to be the innovative, creation-linked, backed economy in 15 years' time from now? I'm not sure. So this is something that we need to think about, and need to think about it quickly.
2 points very quickly. One is that there could be more employment, at least in the U.S., in manufacturing. Like I mentioned earlier, there are a lot. I've seen estimates from 200,000 to 600,000. unfilled, skilled jobs, and you've got a country that's emphasizing kids coming out of college with, $200,000 in debt and not getting the training that they could. But I think the issue of productivity is going to be, hopefully, in one sense, going to be even more reducing of jobs in, let's say, services, because right now a lot of those jobs are low-paid jobs, and I would like to see IT and other technology applied to services. That's why I was emphasizing new industries, because I think that's the only way that we're going to get out of the productivity trap of reducing the number of employed.
Last kind of round of questions, and I'll get the panel to sum up. First of all, though, I would like to ask Abe Reichenthal of 3D Systems to, kind of introduce yourself, but also come back on some of the thoughts of what the panel has said so far.
I'll be delighted. Let me say a few things about 3D Systems. We are the pioneers and inventors of 3D printing, as you know it. It actually happened nearly 30 years ago, March 9 of 1986. And it has taken this long to bring it to fruition, although we've had, we're very grateful to have companies like Jaguar Land Rover as an early adopter and continuous customer of the technology. And in terms of 3D printing, I think that it's on the verge of changing everything as we know it, in the sense that it's going to change how we create, how we innovate, how we communicate, how we animate, how we educate, how we deal with medical device and medical treatments. And it's going to be an empowering tool that will flatten the universe in terms of garage entrepreneur and deep-pocketed companies alike having access to the same technology. And it will enable the relocalization of distributed manufacturing as we know it. So, that's now, in terms of the manufacturing economy in the UK and in the United States, I'm actually quite optimistic. I think that there is a great deal of heritage of engineering and technology in the UK and in the United States, and there is a great deal of technology and innovation that will enable it, from artificial intelligence to robotics to sensing technology and 3D printing, that, in my view, is going to transform and enable manufacturing in ways that we haven't even conceived of. Our job is to believe that we can do it and to actually make it happen.
I want to hear about Eugene Polly, who invented the remote control unit, which has done so much for obesity around the world. And I think what we've got to do is, when they have these debates like David Cameron about energy prices, nobody wants to discuss is there any new technology behind energy. It's all done in prices, or it's done in taxes. Siemens makes a 6-megawatt turbine where it's gearless. There are no gears in there. Instead, you have a workshop in the nacelle and a coffee machine. So that kind of romance of manufacturing is what I think we need to hear about. Let's not be defensive about, we're not respected, engineers aren't paid enough, our status isn't low enough, we've all got an all-male lineup full of geeks and nerds and, no women here. And or alternatively, we've got some women engineers at last. All of that stuff. It's too defensive. On the other hand, we have all this sort of flag-waving stuff about Johnny Ives. So I think we've got to get the balance right and keep getting away from prices and taxes onto real stuff.
I wondered what role the panel thought the EU had to play in the revival. In particular, the recent figure shows that exports to the EU from the UK are down 7.8%. And more particularly, last year, BASF's R&D base relocated from Europe to the US because of the EU's precautionary principle.
Okay. Thank you.
Why is nobody talking about aligning what markets want now and in the future with what we're manufacturing?
Okay, useful point to make. So look, panel, I'd like for you to come back and sum up.
The point was mentioned earlier here about something to cohere around, and it's a shame we couldn't really get into that further, but I think there are just some really simple things, and James here mentioned Cameron, but from the leadership, I was very disappointed when Barack Obama basically cut funding in the space program and shifted it from manned missions to private enterprise, because just purely on the symbolic level, it was basically saying we're not interested in exploration anymore, about new horizons. I mean, leaving aside specifics of the space program, I mean, just even in things like around energy, right? Just a defense of big things like nuclear power and large scale hydrofracking, instead of all this emphasis on, let's save energy, let's, individual behavior, really small stuff. I mean, just the bully pulpit, could, in itself, would be a real advance if we had leadership that would just put out those ideas just to get people talking and debating that.
I think that it's been an interesting debate. What is certainly clear is that we need to focus, redouble our efforts on innovation, whether that's Cambridge or ISIS and Oxford or even somebody in their garage, and make funding available much easier easily available to those types of people. I think as well we need to be fairly focused and clear on what we can do and what we can't do, and not throw good money after bad. And I think I'll end there, actually.
Thank you.
The main thing is education and publicity. Tell people what is possible, what's going on now, indicate that it is exciting, get James Woodhousen in to be rude about people and inspire them at the same time. That's my recipe for the future.
And last up, Mike.
Well, the topic of this session was the great comeback. I think it's quite enlightening that there's a lot of people in the room that are saying there's a great future for manufacturing. We've got to do it differently. We've got to be more challenging. And it's to come back to the EU point. I'm not an expert on EU politics, but even there are signals that they recognise that they've lost their competitiveness, and certain of the commissions out there are starting to look at different ways of. Somebody talked about BSF going out of Europe. They recognise that they could lose their intellectual innovation skill base, and if that goes, then the manufacturing issue for Europe will get even worse. So I think there's a sea change happening out there, which is good.
Okay, thank you. Can we applaud our speakers for a very, very fascinating introduction?